today we are going to continue to discuss the issues of inequality, income inequality. And this roundtable is, since we saw that there has been a lot of improvement in Brazil in the last decades, and also that inequality is still very high in Brazil. We thought that it could be interesting to discuss what are the challenges, what are the conditions to continue reducing inequality in the country. Is this possible or not? What are the problems to continue sustainable policies for reducing inequalities? Yesterday, we have already introduced Canuto and Marta. I won't repeat this, but I have a great pleasure to introduce today Professor Ricardo Paes de Barros. Professor Ricardo Paes de Barros is the chief economist of the Institute Ayrton Senna and professor at Insper. He has a long trajectory in discussing these issues. He's certainly one of the most important Brazilian specialists in issues of inequality. He has a master's degree from Insper, which in Brazil means something, and a PhD from Chicago. He has been a researcher for a long time at IPEA, and he was actually, at some point, the director of the Council for Social Studies at IPEA from 1999 to 2002. He also has been at Undersecretary of Strategic Actions at the Secretary of Strategic Affairs, related to the presidency. And, well, Ricardo, it's very good to have you here. And since you didn't talk yet, we'll begin with you, okay?
I think I can, because I probably will move back and forth here. So. Okay, so good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. And this presentation, in principle, have two parts. But I will, given all the debates that have been going on here, I will skip showing you that all social issues or most social issues, and in particular the inequality and poverty in Brazil, has declined very sharply over the past 15 years. And even with the current recession, of course, poverty increased, but inequality never went up again, even during this difficult years of the past 2 years. So we have been able in Brazil really to take a trajectory of reducing inequalities and caring seriously about inequality. So we have this very successful recent history of reducing inequality. I can show you very quickly some graphs, okay? But I will not get into this discussion very much because I think you guys already know the thing. There is a recent debate in Brazil that that we were all wrong, that inequality actually has not declined in Brazil. When you look at the income tax records, when you include the income of the very rich, that actually inequality has not declined in Brazil. We are finishing people in Paris, Piketty and other people. They have been trying to do these calculations for Brazil, and they actually come up with the idea that inequality was stable. Actually, we are redoing what he did, and including all the information about the income of the poor, because of course the income of the rich, it's under-declared on our, it's not fully recorded, the income of the rich, but also the income of the poor is not fully taken into consideration. So when we do all the calculation again and include the income of the rich and income of the poor, we still have not finished the work, but it's very clear that inequality has declined in Brazil very sharply. And just look at the level of consumption of the poor, you can see that's much, much higher than it used to be. So it could not possibly be the case that the inequality is not went down. So even taking into consideration the income tax records that I'm not including in this presentation here, can tell you that we are almost sure that also inequality went down. Okay, so let me just give you a few graphs just to remind you that the Brazilian progress, it's unbelievable. It's actually one thing that Brazil did in the past decade that it's called the attention of everybody in the world, because it's really fantastic and it's real. Well, one way to see this is the map of the Human Development Index. You can see that this is in 2000. This red, it's a very low Human Development Index, typically sub-Saharan Human Development Index. So Brazil was like this. The yellow, it's a middle range, and the green, it's a distant Human Development Index. Well, if you look to Brazil 10 years later, you get this picture. Actually, when the office of the UNDP in New York saw this map, they said, well, if we have this map for the world, we could close UNDP. Okay, that's all what we want to see for the world. Okay, and actually Brazil did that, and you can see that the northeast of Brazil was completely red, and it's there's a lot of yellow parts, mainly in Ceará, and a little bit in the west of Pernambuco, but mainly in Ceará, it's quite yellow. So there's a lot of progress. Piauí had an amazing progress over this period. You can see that the center and the southeast of Brazil, it's mainly green. Okay, so it's a fantastic progress if you measure by the Human Development Index. If you look at the level of inequality, you can see that inequality was very high and suddenly it started to decline very, very sharply. I remember in 2000 to be talking about inequality in Oxford, and then people with the traditional English humor, because up to 2000, you can see the inequality in Brazil was going up and down, and it was completely flat up to 2000. So I showed this graph up to 2000, and the famous economist Angus Deaton, that actually ended up winning the Nobel Prize, he raised his hand and said, well, I don't understand Brazilians. Why? Because here in the UK, we collect data on things that we have intention to change. You are very strange people. You collect a lot of data. You told me that you collect data on 10 million people to do this graph. I believe you, but why people collect data on 10 million people about something they have no plan to change? Why collect data repeatedly of something that's completely stable? We should go there 10 years later, and so well, we changed our minds. We are now serious about reducing that thing. And that it's important that each ball in that graph, each little ball in that graph, it's a year. And it's computed with 500,000 people. So actually, it's amazing that it's not that we change inequality from one year to the other. It's not that we have 2 points and we fluctuate a lot going down. No, we went to a systematic path of reducing inequality, okay? And we did that year after year in a persistent way, and there is years with big recession, world recessions, and years with a lot of growth, and inequality was going down in all cases almost at the same pace. So it was kind of a country, society determination, well, we are going to reduce this inequality. The problem with this graph is the scale, because as I'm going to show you, after doing all this stuff, we are well above the inequality in all countries in the world. So we did a lot, but not enough. Well, this is just showing you, it's in Portuguese, but it tells you that from 2014 to 2015, that we were in a deep recession, the inequality was stable. So even in the worst situation, we didn't allow the inequality to go up, and you can see that's going down all the years. Let me skip most of the stuff. That's decline on poverty, and you can see that decline in poverty was very sharp. And Brazil, well, everybody say, well, you should reduce poverty to a half, or extreme poverty to one half. Starting from 1990, we should reach 2015 with one half of the poverty that we started in 1990. Let's say you have to reduce poverty to a half in 25 years. And to reduce poverty, it's a complicated thing because it depends on hundreds of things, and there are very different reasons why different people are poor. So it's a hard indicator to change. Particularly for Brazil, that was not famous for doing anything very productive to solve social problems. And it's amazing that Brazil actually reached this goal 10 years in advance. And when Brazil reached this goal, inequality was declining in Brazil at a rate that was many-fold faster than the original goal. So we were kind of reducing extreme poverty 3 times faster than what you need to actually reduce poverty to a half in 25 years. Okay, so we can talk about many. Let me just stop here and say that many people say, well, you did that with pure solidarity. You did that just, well, it's easy to do. You just transfer money to the poor. The poor is very poor, so you give them a very small amount of money and you can reduce inequality a lot. That's absolutely true. The poor is very poor. The top 10%, if you take the 20 million people in Brazil, they live with 1% of the national income. And the second 20 million live with 2% of the national income. So it's a huge inequality. Of course, if we transfer 1% of the national income to the very poor, we double their income. So it's we can with 1% of national income, we can have a 100% increase in income of the poor, because as Betinho was remind us a long time ago, said, well, to fight poverty, the poor is very inexpensive. So actually, if you have the right program to fight poverty, the hard thing is to design one that's effective, but if you have one that's effective, it's very cheap, because the poor is very cheap. So you can say, well, you did all that just transferring money to this poor. I mean, they were absolutely extremely poor, so you give them some money, and they increase their income a lot. What's the point? Okay, you should do that, but it's not really anything really memorable. But this graph tells you that that's not the case. We did much more than that. We did a much more sustainable thing, because the blue part, so the height of this graph, it's what's the growth rate of each tenth of the distribution. So if you look at the first what is that?
No.
The first bar is the growth rate. I think so. The first bar is the growth rate of the. So oops, yeah, this bar here is the growth rate for the bottom 10%. So these guys are the guys that have 1% of the national income. So what's the growth rate for these guys over the past 15 years? Their income, their per capita income, were growing like 8% per year. Okay, and this group here, the second group, with 6% per year, right? And the very rich were growing by 2% per year. Okay, so you have a situation where everybody, the income of everybody increase. So in the way economists see this, they say this is a Pareto improvement because everybody is getting better off. But the poor, it's increasing much faster than the rich. So we have the inequality in the growth rates. So if you want to reduce inequality, you need to have inequality in the growth rate. So it's strange, but to reduce inequality, you have to have inequality in the growth rate, because if everybody grow at the same rate, you just preserve inequality. So you need inequality in growth rates in the right direction, right? You need the poor to grow faster than the rich, and they actually did. That's great, but they earn nothing. So giving to people that if someone has an income equal to zero, if you give them $10, then it's an infinite growth rate. So to some extent, you can say that this growth rates, it's kind of easy to get if you transfer income, but this blue it's how this would look like if we had not make any transfers. And you can see from here that the growth rate for the poor, the labor income, the autonomous income of the poor, it's very fast. So actually, we did a reduction in inequality with a lot of inclusion, of productive inclusion. So actually, we increase the earnings. So we provide real human development in the sense that people really become capable of earning an income that will give them more freedom to choose the life they wish, and they have a reason to wish. Okay, so it's really impressive for all these reasons, but at the end we end up like this. So this is the inequality of Brazil after all this, and that's inequality in Mexico, I think, in Turkey or something like that. But the point is, Brazil has an inequality that's above and well above all the OECD countries after this 15 years. Okay, so the point is, we did a lot, but absolutely not enough. So we have to continue that, and I'm glad that this table here is exactly to discuss how we are going to do that. And the point is that we need to do everything we did in the past. We have to do over again, and probably over and over again. And the challenging thing, I will not say difficult thing, but certainly a challenging thing, is that probably to reach the same decline in inequality, we have not to do the same things we did in the past, because the nature of poverty and the nature of inequality is completely different now. So we have to do completely different things. So it's like in health, when you increase life expectancy by 3 years, you do that by eliminate some disease. If you want to do that again, you have to do something else, because what we have done will not bring you extra years of life expectancy, because you're now revealing other problems. So what we did in the past 15 years solved many. So all the nutrition problems in Brazil, we essentially solved. Of course, there is some pockets of people. There are some 3-4% of people that we need to help them, but it's very localized, and we have to do with very specific. There's some people in São Paulo in the streets that are hungry, so we have to take care of them. But it's not a famine. It's not people are hungry all over a region. There is nothing like that anymore in Brazil. So the malnutrition indicators for the northeast of Brazil are similar to the southeast and south of Brazil. So this problem is kind of solved, but all the problems are surfacing, and then we have to redirect our. The reason why the poor cannot be incorporated in the labor market has changed over time, so we have to change our policy. So what so I would like to move quickly to what we need to do. Well,
Hello? Ok. Tudo bem, deixa. Pega esse.
Okay. Sorry. I destroy one, so let's see if I keep this one functioning. Okay. So the point is, all these fantastic results, all these fantastic social results were not accomplished without generating some imbalances. And to some extent, it's easy to have social progress if you can generate imbalances. Okay? So I'll show you that we have at least 2 gigantic imbalances that we have to solve. Okay? So the challenge for the future is that we have to adjust for the imbalances that we generate, okay, and do something else in terms of social policy to move on. Okay? So let's see which kind of imbalance we did. One, we all know, we generate a fiscal imbalance that is just ridiculous. I mean, the government expenditure increase as a percentage of GDP like crazy. We are among the 25% of countries in the world that spend more. We have a huge government, and if you want to spend more, no problem, but please earn more. Okay, so if you want to spend more money, I have nothing against that. But please, first earn that income, and then you can spend. Okay, if you want to spend little and earn a lot, great, because then you can save, and we are glad that you are saving. But if you don't want to save, it's okay. But if you want to spend more than what you get, then it's a problem. And the Brazilian government is spending much more than what we are getting. Either we increase taxes substantially, or we cut expenditure. We cannot tax the future by running deficits year after year. Okay, so we have a huge problem, and we probably change government because of that. Not that it's a good reason for doing that, but that probably was a major reason. And the problem for any government in the future is exactly how to balance this. Okay? And the point is, because to fight poverty is so inexpensive, you can do that and reduce poverty without any problem. Okay? The second problem that's very complicated for Brazil is that we have been increasing wages much, much faster than productivity. Okay? We kind of increase over the past 15 years. The red line is how we were increasing wages, and the blue line is how we were increasing productivity. So no economy in the world can actually increase wages faster than productivity in a systematic way. Of course, you can do that for a while, and if you do that, every time you increase wages above productivity, you are doing a distribution of income from capital to labor. Okay? You can do that for a while. You can redistribute income from capital to labor, and we did that a lot over the past 15 years. But there is a limit for that, and probably we have already reached this limit. So from now on, we can only increase wages if we increase productivity. Okay, we are kind of at the limit on that, and the increase in wages were crucial for that blue area that I presented before. We were able to reduce poverty a lot because the wages of the poor increase a lot. But if the wages of the poor increase without increasing productivity, this would not be sustainable. So we generate this extra imbalance. Well, the other thing that I will not get into great detail here, but we can talk, is that Brazil was successful in many things, but not in education. And if you want to do a sustainable reduction in poverty and inequality, you have to be successful in education. Okay? So this is just telling you that the Brazilian education system, it's one generation behind the Chilean education system, in the sense that the education that our youth is getting, it's identical to the education that the parents of the current youth in Chile got 25 years ago. Okay, so we are 25 years behind Chile, and so we are one generation behind Chile. And if we look at the PISA results, so the quality of education in Brazil, it's down there. So this is quality. We are in quantity. We are 25 years behind Chile. In quality, you are really problematic. So let me just show you that Brazil has an extra problem with the meaning of education. And this is a very provocative graph that you can see in this graph that the horizontal x is your education level, and the vertical x is your productivity. Okay, so you can see Chile in this graph that increased education. This is a 30-year period, 1980 to 2010. You can see that Chile increased the education on horizontal x and increased the productivity in the vertical x. So the slope of this, it's how you translate education into productivity. Okay? So that's Chile. That's the slope of how you translate education in productivity. If you look, so you were wondering, well, everybody's like Chile. But okay, so if you look at, what's there, Malaysia? Malaysia and China, you can see that Malaysia and China are kind of following essentially the same slope as Chile. So it's converting education and productivity at the same rate. Okay? We don't think education should be there just to increase productivity, but we hope education, beyond being a human right, should also help increase productivity and so increase wages and so reduce poverty. Well, everybody looks like this. Not everybody, because, you know, Korea, it's always there, and that's Korea. Korea, of course, translate education in a lot of productivity, okay? But then how Brazil fits into this graph, and Brazil fits in this graph like this. So actually Brazil, it's completely horizontal. So we invest a lot on education without any consequence on productivity, which means that either we were able to fulfill the dreams of some of providing education that has no use for the capitalist system at all, or the capitalist system is not actually being able to use the fantastic education that the Brazilian education system is providing. But certainly, they are not talking to each other. So the education and the economic system in Brazil are not talking to each other. So either the economic system is not being able to use the education that we are producing, or the education that we are producing is not paying attention to what the economic system needs. So it's a problem, because we are investing a lot on education. We are actually the country that we our expenditure per student increased 12% per year over the past 10 years. And that's the greatest increase in expenditure per student in the world. So we are really increasing our expenditure in education, which is a good thing because we have a huge deficit in education. But we should do that just because education is a human right. But we should expect that this human right being fulfilled, people will increase their productivity and so their wages, and so they will leave poverty. Well, the other challenge for Brazil is aging. We have a strange social policy that, even though our constitution said that we should benefit first and take care first of children, we actually do the reverse, and we give priority to the elderly. So the transfers that we do to the elderly are much higher than the transfers that we give to children and to small children. And that was okay, probably, in the past, because we have very little. The number of old people were very small, fraction of the population, and you can say, well, they were very poor in the past. We did nothing about them, for them, over many years, so we should compensate them in a very generous way. Well, that's okay on the past. The problem is our demographic transition, it's very fast. Our demographic transition, it's 6 times faster than the demographic transition in France. I'm going to show you this graph. So if you look at that, red line, that red line says that probably we get 5–6% of the population that is above 70 years. So it's a very small group. But the problem is that what's going to happen in the near future? Look to what's going to happen in the near future. This is going to go up very, very sharp. It will multiply by 4 very fast. So if you are being very generous to this group, this generosity will cost you 4 or 5 times more in a few decades. So either you are prepared to pay for this generosity, and then you have to increase taxes a lot to compensate for every time that thing goes up, you have to increase taxes to compensate that. Or you have to rethink about how this generosity should be indexed by the increasing your per capita income. The other way is that you don't increase that generosity at the same rate as your economy grow. You increase it by less than the growth rate in your per capita income. Well, you can see, okay, but let me show you this graph. This graph, it's showing you the aging of the population. This is how many years it takes for a country. Demographers, they measure aging by how many years it takes for you to reduce the proportion of people that are 65 years and older from 7% of the population to 14% of the population. Okay? In France, which is the green bar, it took almost 120 years for the population above 65 years to increase from 7% to 14%. And this thing is going to happen in Brazil in 20 years. So in 20 years, we are going to be aging as much as France aged in 120 years. Every time a population is aged, your social policy has to change. Your social security system has to adapt to that. Your tax system has to adapt to that. France had 120 years to adapt to that. We are going to have 20 years. It's less than 1 generation. So you cannot change the rules of Social Security fast because you are going to change the rules in the middle of the game. So you have to be slow on that. And if you are aging at this rate, that's a serious problem. And it's a serious problem because this is a this is a funny feature. It's a strange feature, unusual feature of Brazil that maybe one thing that Brazil should want to keep, but if you want to keep that, then you have to have the money to support that. That is how much the government spends on an elderly compared to how much it spends on a child. All countries, this number is around 2. So I spend twice as much with an elderly person than I spend with a child, even though our constitution say, well, children should have all priority, okay? But we don't spend twice as much with the elderly. We spend 10 times as much, okay? We have a transfer to the elderly, and which is what we call BPC. It's a program that transfers income to the elderly. And we have a program that transfers income to children, which is Bolsa Família, okay? The amount that you transfer to the elderly, it's 20 times or more greater than the amount you transfer to children. So Bolsa Família, it's wonderful because it's actually transfer a small amount to a large number of children that are poor, so it's alleviating poverty with a lot of children. So the transfers that we make to the elderly in Brazil take elderly that's extremely poor and put them above the median of the country. So it's a very huge transfer. Okay, I repeat, it takes a guy that's poor and after the guy receives the transfer, he goes above the median of the country. Okay, so it's you cannot really take everybody above the median because the median is the median, but you actually take the elderly and put them above the median. The consequence of that is this graph, which is the poverty in Brazil over the age group. So this is age, and that's the level of poverty or extreme poverty. You can see the extreme poverty among children. It's twice the average. So if this is extreme poverty for the country, among families with small children, poverty is twice the average. And among the elderly, it's 6 times below the average. So actually, this poverty is 10 times bigger than this poverty. In a country that's actually aging very fast, you are accomplishing this by a huge amount of transfer to the elderly. And what you're doing is increasing this. So you're increasing the number of people here, so you are going to run in a gigantic deficit unless you reduce your generosity to the elderly or you change your tax system and become a country that is going to have a much higher tax. But don't do nothing because that will not that will generate enormous fiscal deficit. So you have to choose. Either you reduce your generosity to the elderly or you reshuffle expenditure from other things to the elderly, or you increase taxes. Okay, so I think this is a good place to start in terms of long-term challenges. But mainly, what I'm saying here, just to summarize, is that we inherited some important imbalances: a fiscal imbalance and wage productivity imbalance that we have to solve, okay? And we have several deficits with our population. Mainly, we have to improve education a lot because education was not among one of the things that we should be proud over the past 15 years. That's not the area that we have more progress. But more problematic than that, we have to give meaning to this education, or at least to enhance the meaning to beyond the meaning that it has now. You also have to talk to the productivity system. Otherwise, the education is not going to help to reduce poverty in the future. And we have this big issue of a very fast aging population, how we organize our expenditure so we don't blow up our budget, and we are not unfair with children compared to the elderly population. Thank you.
Great.
So, good morning, everybody, and congratulations for all of us for being working on a Saturday morning here on a very sunny and brilliant day. It's a pleasure to share this roundtable with Ricardo and Otaviano, who were two very influential scholars on this debate on the challenges to continuing reducing inequality in countries like us, or you and I suspect we are keep talking about Brazil, right? I have two warnings on what I'm, two preliminaries on what I'm going to talk about in a minute. First of all, I will talk about what I think are the political challenges to keep going ahead on reducing inequality in a country like Brazil, for the simple reason that we have two economists on the table, so I wouldn't dare to say a word about that. And second, I'm not going to talk about the specific details of policies, but I'm trying to make a broad picture on the kind of challenges we may face in the future. I talked yesterday that I understand that in the last 30 years from the under the democratic periods, there were very favorable political conditions to governments adopt policies that favor the worst situated in our country, and our speculation nowadays is whether we'll have the same conditions in the future, and that's the subject I'm trying to speculate a bit this morning to discuss about. So we rely upon theories about the results of comparative studies to understand under what conditions a country can adopt inequality reduction policies. One very influential theory I've talked about yesterday is the median voter theory, which says that most democracies have the income distribution is skewed to the right, meaning that the majority of voters' earnings is below the average. And so, under democracy or under universal suffrage, these voters can rationally calculate that they have more to earn than to spend, since they will receive more from the state than they will pay taxes. And so this theory says that any society which combines income inequality and universal suffrage will move in the long term toward redistribution. This theory does not talk about specific details of this trend, but it says this is the tendency. Of course, this theory is under strong scrutiny now, because since we know that even developed countries democratic ones are the inequality has been increased in the last 30 years. But as I told you yesterday, around 80% of the Brazilian population does not earn enough money to pay direct taxes, and we can think that they tend to benefit from state policies. This is what this graphic shows. This graphic is based upon several surveys on public opinion support to state policies. So interviewers were asked whether they are in favor of the state actively acting to adopt policies aiming at reducing inequality. Look at the year 2008. And the interviewers are split into different, let's say, earning strata. So people earning less than 1 minimum wage, people earning more than 10 minimum wage, people earning between 1 and 2 minimum wages, and so on. But what the graph is showing, what the data is showing about 2008, it is that at that year, there was a strong support among any strata of the population to the state intervention to reduce inequality. But observe that support declined since then. And so in 2014, all income strata converged to a lower support to the state intervention to adopt policies to reduce inequality. It's still high because 80% of each strata support this kind of action, but it is declining. And a survey made by Oxfam last year showed that this rate last year was around 72%. It's still the majority, but it is declining. The same for a similar behavior regards support to raising taxes to fund state social policies. Observe that there was different preferences among different strata, and in 2014 we observe a convergence. Even the poor are not very supportive of raising taxes. So you observe the rates. They were around 40% among the poorest in 2008, and it was around 25% in 2014. So every country displays this kind of contradictory preferences. People want the state to adopt policies to reduce inequality, but people don't want to pay taxes for. This is a dream every country has. So what can change this kind of behavior? A second theory argues that left-wing parties must be important in the political competition. Either the left must be in power, or at least the left must be electorally competitive. So the left wing must threaten right-wing powers. So, and we observed this game in Brazil in the last 30 years or so. So even if the Workers' Party, which is the leading party within the left, did not win the elections, it was competitive. There was always this threat that the left-wing parties could win the elections. We do not know what is going to happen in the future. The truth is that the share of votes of PT and the share of votes of the left-wing parties has been declining since 2006, 2010, 2014. So if the power of the left is crucial to push right-wing and center-wing parties toward inclusive agenda, we must wait for the next year, this year's election, to understand what will be the profile of the Congress. But in any case, if the median voter theory is right, we could expect that in the long run, some left-wing party will replace the Workers' Party, because this kind of voter pushing and voting for redistribution is not going to disappear. Maybe the party that nowadays obtains their votes might disappear, but the preferences of voters will not disappear. So we could expect that even in the case that PT declines in getting the votes of the poorest, another party in the long run will replace it. It's the kind of inference we can make. But the left-wing power theory advances another critical argument. In any democracy, neither which has more than two parties, neither the left nor the right-wing parties has the majority of votes. So it depends. The outcome depends on for which side the center sides. So that it is very important to know which side center-wing voters are going to side in the future. And that we don't know. But it's we should expect, at least for the next election, maybe the next elections, to understand what would be the kind of party composition in Congress we're going to have. At this point, we don't know. There are many. We don't even know what candidates we'll have. So, let alone the outcome of the elections. Another argument says that policies make politics. So this argument advances that policies create constituencies, and so policy stickiness. What does it mean? Bolsa Família created a large constituency which will vote for its survival, which will punish politicians that vote against Bolsa Família. Since this is a highly visible policy, it's not possible to hide this kind of vote. So the same for the pension system, the same for the health system. So politicians know that if they vote against these policies, their competitor in the district they gain elections will charge them for making people's life worse. So, but this is not a broad kind of competition, but it's a mechanism driven by policies. So if this theory is correct, it will be very difficult to change, to eliminate Bolsa Familia, the pension system, the health policy, because large constituencies, a large amount of voters will behave so as to stick to preserve these policies. And as politicians know that, they will take into account when making their decisions. So if this theory is correct, the system we have now may change, but it won't change radically. It will make the innovation more difficult, but because there is not enough room for innovation. There is a fight about the allocation of the expenditure, but those policies that benefit a large amount of voters will remain, will stick. But another argument is very, very problematic. It comes from a study made by Alesina and published at the American Economic Review. It was published in 2015, I guess. And it is the result of an experimental study. And it says that this demonstrates that distrust in government destroys support to policies, even if voters believe in these policies. And so, for example, if voters do not trust the government, they may turn out being against a policy they believe in. So let's, for example, think about the Bolsa Familia. Even if voters are in favor of Bolsa Familia, they turn out being against it if they don't trust the government that will be in charge of implementing it. So if voters are in favor of increasing taxes to fund better social policies, in principle, they may turn out being against it because they don't trust the government. And so the crisis in political trust we are going through may destroy all the support I've been talking about. And according to Alesina, this is the source of the trust in private solutions. Because if voters do not trust the government, they bet that private solutions might work better, even if they are in favor of the design of that policies. So we have theories we've been working with point to different directions in the future. If the median voter theory is right, we could expect that the majority will vote for redistribution policies in the future, and politicians will adjust to these preferences. If the left-wing power theory is right, and the left-wing parties lose voters, we might not have in the futures parties representing the poor. And so it will be easier to approve policies that do not aim at redistribution. If the third theory is right, we can bet in the stickiness of these policies. But if the fourth theory is right, we cannot see support for state policies in the future, because we know for sure that Brazilian voters do not trust the political system at this point, and we cannot see any sign in the future that it's going to change sharply. So we cannot say nothing for sure, because we do not know how these variables are going to work in the future. And so we can, so as in social science, even the past is uncertain, because, you know, as interpretation changes, our vision of even the past changes. We cannot gonna say not very much for sure in the future. The only thing we can say that how these variables behaved in the past, it's not clear that it will behave in the same way in the future. So there is at least we have room for concern if we will have in the near future political support for continued inequality reduction policies. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Professor Canuto.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here again. Benefiting from the two superb presentations that we had today and our discussion yesterday, that's going to make my life easy. Let me make three series of comments, overall very much, I believe, consistent with what we saw before today. The first one, on a broad sense, what does it take for a set of policies to reduce inequality? In that regard, we should keep in mind the important difference between flows and stocks. Either we speak about inequality of income, which is the flow of how the income generated in a certain country is shared, reflecting the use of assets by the participants of this economy, and the other inequality, which is the wealth inequality, the inequality in the distribution of assets. Of course, both are intertwined in the sense that, as I said, the income distribution depends substantially from the distribution of wealth, and vice versa. It is the flow, the consecutive flows that allow the agents to accumulate assets. But it's important to keep in mind the difference, because policies can be seen as dealing with the two sides of this unity. You saw yesterday in some of the charts that I presented how the market income distribution in the economies is shown to be much more unequal than the distribution of income after one takes into account taxes and government spending. So even to different extents, and I will address this in the case of Brazil, the policies acting on the flows, on the income through taxation and spending, they tend to alter the configuration of the income distribution. So, whereas, of course, ultimately, the evolution over time depends a lot on what happens with the evolution of the asset inequality, with wealth inequality. And so this is important to call attention to the fact that the flow policies, policies on income, if they really are geared at changing the configuration of futures income distributions, they have to keep an eye on the creation of assets, on helping the poor or those situated in the bottom of the pyramid or in the middle class to increase their assets. And that's where the role of education comes to the fore. Definitely, it is not via asset transfers. It's not by appropriation of capital. This has shown to have deleterious effects in the medium to long term in the capital accumulation. So it's a lose-lose, as all populist experiences have shown. Look at Venezuela. Look at several moments in the world history in which the temptation of grabbing assets from the private sector and on behalf of the poor ended up having consequences that were not sustainable. So the fact is that the major focus for connecting tax and particularly public spending policies should be geared at creation of assets. And that includes particularly human capital, which depends a lot on education and health. Of course, when we talk about education and health, we have to keep an eye as well on the issue that it is not a matter of quantity. For instance, it's well known how proportionately Brazil spends a lot in education. But the problem is that Brazil, as measured by the results, by the educational outcomes and the redistributive impacts of education, Brazil spends badly. So definitely the issue of quality of spending, particularly in the case of education, is maybe the major key. I ended up talking before I wanted on Brazil, but you will find a similar experience elsewhere. I would recommend to all of you who may be interested in this subject the World Development Report of last year, released by the World Bank in October, which is dedicated exactly to education and the pitfalls, and the WDR is capable of finding common traits in all successful and less successful experience with respect to education. Interestingly, there are references there to Sobral, in Ceará, of course. And I would make a parallel. I'm dying to write this, but similar things to Sobral can be found as responsible for a dramatic increase in the performance at the OECD PISA test in the case of Vietnam. Vietnam surprised so many people, was down there, whoo, went up. And when you look, you debunk the experience of Vietnam, it has a lot to do with what I believe, I'm not a pundit on the subject, but with the experience of Sobral, which is namely incentives. You have to have performance-based incentives. That makes a huge difference. And of course, in the case of Vietnam, the performance criteria go beyond pay. There is a process of acknowledgement of a social status that comes with the performance of the students. And so, but the point here is performance-based results are, fundamental, seem to be the key. Thinking of those political theories mentioned by Marta as potential hindrance to policies, I think of the trade unions impeding. Late Governor Eduardo Campos, every time he went to Washington, we had conversations with this. He was a guy who was exactly trying to emulate the policies of Ceará in Pernambuco. And then he told me how hellish his life was becoming because of the resistance from trade unions. So that's a confirmation of that theory. one point that may be interesting to take into account, Marta, the median voter theory is not necessarily incompatible with the data of inequality, rising inequality, with the experience of rising inequality, because of the following. As we saw yesterday in one of the charts that I presented, even in those countries where you have social protection systems, as measured by the share of GDP comprised by social protection public spending, even most of them are featuring inequality, rising inequality. But that, so you may have the following, it's that the underlying capitalist machine may be one that tends to generate asset inequality. You saw in one of the charts how this declined after the Post-World War II, and they have been rising. This may be intrinsic to the system. Of course, things would be worse were not for the social protection systems and the public and tax spending policies in those advanced economies. But it may well be that even if the median voter is putting the government to do that, it's outweighed by the underlying dynamics. So maybe the median voter theory is not necessarily dismissed by the facts. It's simply that it's a complex process below which there's asymmetry of accumulation, which is a point made by Piketty, which may be not wrong at all. Second layer of comments that I would bring, very much convergent with what Pepe approached. Pepe remarked quite well how the bulk of the poverty reduction and the decrease in the income inequality came not from transfer policies, not from conditional cash transfers and so on, but from a dynamics associated with the labor market. And we discussed this yesterday when I remarked, well, not only that, schooling levels. He referred very much. We improved our performance in terms of quantity, and there is so much to do in terms of quality. But the simple, I learned that from his previous studies and so on. If the simple fact that we had in Brazil an improvement in levels of schooling in itself has already made a huge difference. Now, one difficulty I had, and again, this is consistent with what he said, is that our experience in the new millennium was very much unique in terms of pattern of growth. And as I said yesterday, very common to all countries or most countries in South America, which means that there is something else common to these regions, which cannot be simply imputed to our policies. And that had to do with the exceptional period with a pattern of growth very intensive in labor demand for unskilled labor as a consequence of the super commodity price cycle. I'm not denying, I'm not diminishing the relevance of domestic policies. Of course, the intended rise of the minimum wage in Brazil at a pace much faster than productivity transferred income from the rich to the poor, through the middle classes, and so on. This is undeniable. But it would not have been anyway compatible were it not for the super commodity price cycle that allowed a substantial part of the wealth owners in Brazil to become richer without doing anything, and they could pay, and they could transfer the cost, the wage cost, to price. The only loser of that story was the sector producer of tradable goods who could not, who had to face an overvalued exchange rate because of the commodity price, and couldn't push up their prices and so on. This is important because it means it was a real gain. Fortunately, the good news, as Pepe remarked, it has not been reversed, but we cannot go back to that path. The only way forward will be to obtain similar results, but in tandem with productivity increase. Without productivity increase, we don't have the positive sum game that Professor Maria Herminia highlighted yesterday. So the key is productivity for everything else. If we want to dream with keep changing the profile of the Brazilian income distribution, we have to do two things. We have to, first and foremost, do what it takes to increase productivity. By the way, along this new millennium, the performance of productivity in Brazil was dismal, horrible. The total factor productivity even presented negative numbers. So, Houston, we do have a problem in that regard. Third, and in tandem with this, of course, one important component of the agenda towards increasing productivity will be the public sector, will be the state. Not only because of the weight of public spending in the Brazilian GDP, but particularly because that's where we have the hope for changing the path of asset accumulation by boosting the accumulation of assets by the less rich people. And there, and that's my third point, as revealed in a quite important research by the Minister of Finance released last December, that didn't receive, in my view, due attention, apart from a couple of newspaper articles in the following week. But this work done by the Minister of Finance, led by Mansueto, the Secretary, I don't know, I can't remember exactly. It's one of the deputy ministers. Mansueto, everyone knows Mansueto, you know what I mean? Showed clearly the following. Look, I mentioned this yesterday, I believe. When you take the picture of what taxes come, public spending does in most countries, and he compares Brazil with OECD, in those countries of the OECD, they change the picture. They function, even if do not succeed 100% in reversing inequality rise, but they do operate like Robin Hood. In Brazil, very little, but very, 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 very little, particularly in the components of tax and spending that they look at. And that's easy to understand. The bulk of monetary transfers by the Brazilian public sector corresponds to pensions. And pensions that reflect, to a large extent, the underlying income inequality. Not to speak of the unfeasibility of the system. As PB highlighted quite well, the rapid aging simply makes our system, as it is evolving, completely unsustainable. But not only that, pensions, they do not make the role, public pensions, of mitigating inequality as it does, or at least monetary transfers that it does in other indirect countries. Take taxes. Our tax system is heavily based on indirect taxes or a shape in the tax system that is not friendly to the lower part of the income pyramid. Tax is not easy anywhere. It has become increasingly difficult. Fiscal wars among countries. There is a race to reducing corporate taxation. It's a hard sell. The evolution will tend to be trying to tax physical property that cannot change, cannot move. Even income, as I told you yesterday about Marianne, the French. It's hard to tax even income. So the tendency will inevitably be to tax increasingly physical property to the extent that makes a base. You will pay taxes in London in order to live in London. If you want to be based in Paris, you will have to pay higher taxes and so on. But in the Brazilian case, anyway, our current system is one that is terrible when it comes to income distribution. Not to speak of public spending and other areas. I'm touching on sensitive ground, but it is the way, the configuration of the public spending on education. But it's regressive. And off. So, in subsidies, and by the way, Marta, you put the left-wing parties, but what we classify as left-wing is not sometimes much obvious. I understand when you use that, you meant in terms of redistributive policies. That's what you had in mind. To what extent what we did in Brazil with huge transfers, using public debt issued, which is going to be paid by future generations at high interest rates, in order to create a flow of subsidies to private agents, which, by the way, did not invest. To call that left-wing policy, but I take your point. Gramsci, no, not Gramsci, Norberto Bobbio, I like his definition. Let's call left-wing those who don't think that the income distribution is a natural phenomenon, and so on. In that way. So, to close, I guess if we want to talk about, we have to face the constituents. There is no way to make an omelette without breaking the eggs. But it's going to be a review of public spending, which includes a pension reform, which includes a review of the subsidies that we provide. Maybe this is the only part that has been making advance in the last few years. A tax reform, and first and foremost, quality-oriented reform in education. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have some time for questions, considerations. Please come here. If you can say your name and institutional affiliation.
Good morning. My name is Jaciane. I'm a PhD student in sociology from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to hear more about, from the professors, about the quality of the reduction of this income inequality. Marta, since yesterday, has shown us her theoretical view of inequality. For me, it's very clear. But I'm not sure about the theoretical view of inequality from Professor Paes de Barros and Professor Canuto, because I didn't hear much about the quality of this reduction just today in your first appointment. Because, okay, it's an evidence that we had a reduction in the income inequality, but I think that the focus now on the debate about inequality, it's about the quality of it, not just about access and flows, but the outcomes of this reduction. For instance, Professor Canuto mentioned the case of Ceará. What is the quality of this performance? Who is really performance better? What student? What the profile of the students? About outcomes in health? About sociability? What is the quality of this reduction? How can we incorporate in our analysis the quality of this inequality reduction, and also the relational process of this of the inequality? Today, Marta has talk about the political choices, the power, interest, yesterday about groups, how to incorporate more this relational process of producing inequality. And the last question, to show us more the disaggregating outcomes of this inequality by whites and non-whites. I think we have to talk more about the racial outcomes of this reduction. Thank you.
Let's pick up some questions and then please come here.
So good morning. Thank you for your presentations. My name is Nicole. I'm from CEM-Cebrap. We are discussing today inequalities in Brazil, but for me, it was not clear what is considered as policies that led to the reduction of inequalities. We know that we have Bolsa Família, we have the SUS, they have been mentioned, but I would like to hear more about the World Bank view or your views on the direct links, if these policies can be accounted for these reductions of inequality, and what is the future for these policies, because we see that we have had cuts in funding spending for health for 20 years from now. So what would be the future for these policies, and if you consider that they are meaningful for the reduction?
More?
Hi, my name is Ivan Fernandes. I'm from the Federal University of ABC. And I have a question how we can analyze, looking for this inverse Robin Hood problem of the Brazilian state, but it's not about transfers, but about services. If you think how the SUS or other important service was amplified in the last years, I think in the book that Marta Arretche published last year, it's talk a lot about this multi-dimensional aspect of the reduction inequality of Brazil. It's not just the transfer of income, but more service, more. Last day there are some graphics about electricity. So I think how can we put these results of the service on this question about the Robin Hood, inverse Robin Hood nature of Brazilian state? And in a second question, how about the equality of opportunities? Income is not, in the end of the day, income is not the most important variable. Income is something that is a proxy for equality of opportunities. How we can, all these movements, this difference that we saw in Brazil, some problems and some good aspects, they affect the equality of opportunities in our country.
Matias Alencastro from CEBRAP. I think we have a really precise picture about the role of the public sector in reducing inequality from your two presentations. But I think the idea of the role of the private sector is much less clear. And I was wondering if you, Ricardo, could tell us what has been the role of the private sector, whether it has one, and whether it has been effective in reducing inequality over the past 30 years. And you, Marta, how could you unpack your definition of private sector when you say that the population is eager to turn to private services? Do you mean the church, big companies, people who pretend to be businessmen, like the mayor of São Paulo, and yeah, that would be my question.
Any more questions? Okay, we have questions enough.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Let me try to answer a few that I can. I mean, they're very important questions, but you know, science cannot solve all of them, unfortunately. Well, I would say that we know for sure that the inequality in Brazil declined a lot, and I would say the quality of this decline, if I understand what quality of decline in inequality means, I would say we have all, we met all standards of quality for the reduction in inequality, in the sense that was not a decline from one year to the other and then we stay constant. So it's not the kind of thing that you achieve by confiscation of assets or anything like that. Was year by year painful, small reduction in inequality every single year. So we get a 15 years of continuous decline in inequality that was recently interrupted by a sharp recession, but not the reverse of the decline in inequality. So in this sense, it's very good. I mean, because it's a continuous decline. And that's good when you are changing something. If I change something from one year to the other, I don't know if that's sustainable. But if I keep changing the same thing over and over again, that's good. The second thing is that nobody knows why we were able to reduce. We have many accounting systems. So I can tell you that more than half of the, or at least half of the decline in inequality in Brazil occur because the wage gap between well-educated and least educated workers declined sharply. So the gap between people with low education, people with higher education, was reduced sharply, and that, because we have a lot of inequality in education, and because that gap was gigantic before, was extremely important. But nobody knows how much of that is because what Canuto was saying was due to, because that happens in many Latin American countries. So to what extent that was due to an increase in the minimum wage? How much was that due to a change in the demand for labor, that you have a sharp increase in the demand for low-skilled labor that actually increased? How much of that was because we increased the education of people a lot, so the market could not actually consume all that education, so the price of education went down? So we know the price of education went down, and inequality was reduced a lot because of this sharp decline in the price of education. We don't know exactly why education now in Brazil is much less valuable than it was 15 years ago, because there are many competing explanations for that. To myself, I think it's one, I cannot explain. People used to say the following: if you have a growth in productivity in a country, and you can discover exactly from where that change in growth came from, that's not a good change in productivity. So if I know Brazil has grown because increased the price of soybeans or something like that, it's not a good idea, because that will not continue year after year. But if you try to understand the growth of productivity in Korea, you cannot explain it, because it's so widespread across all sectors. The productivity in services sector, it's increasing like crazy in Korea, so you cannot really explain exactly how. So when you cannot explain exactly how productivity is increasing, so scientists is crazy and they cannot explain, okay? Society say we are good, because that means this is sustainable, because it's kind of so spread all over the place that it's wide-based growth. So we are happy. So I would say the decline in inequality in Brazil was good, because it was so, it was related to the decline in the black and white gap. It was not much men and women, but black and whites gap was reduced. Education gaps were reduced. Regional gaps were reduced. So you have the reductions. The labor markets in these small cities were start paying salaries similar to the in large cities. So you get regional gaps going down. So you get all kinds of gaps going down at the same time. So it's very hard to explain this, but that's good because that means this is a widespread phenomena, so it's more likely to be sustainable and actually solid, okay? So in this sense, the decline in inequality in Brazil is good because it's a continuous and unexplained by scientists phenomena, and that's good for the reduction in education. The other two reasons why the reduction in inequality is very good, it's first because it's not accomplished mainly, but let's say 20% of it, it's government transfers, but most of it is actually productive inclusion. Is the poor being integrated to the Brazilian economy? The increase in the formalization of labor relation, it's astonishing in Brazil over this period. So actually we incorporate a very large fraction of the Brazilian population into the formal economy. So it's good in the sense that we reduce inequality by increasing the autonomous income of people. And finally, it's a very good reduction in inequality because it's mainly a reduction in inequality in opportunity. If you measure inequality of opportunity, Brazil has a very sharp decline in inequality of opportunity in education, in health, in housing, in electricity, in many, many things. We have a very sharp reduction in opportunities. So it's not just a reduction in outcomes that's not based on the reduction in opportunity. So when you reduce the inequality in opportunities, you have a reduction in the inequality in outcomes that is more sustainable. So I would say we have a very solid reduction in inequality. Our great challenge is that, as Canuto mentioned, we need to do all this fantastic stuff all over again. And we have to do it correcting the imbalance that we generate in the past based on economic growth and increasing labor productivity, and in a completely different way. So we have to change our social policy drastically. So our education is not just low quality, it's probably low meaning, which is different from low quality. We learn little, but the little we learn doesn't make much sense. So it's a gigantic change on our entire policies. In some areas, we are doing very well. Other areas, we're doing very poorly. Youth policy in Brazil, we have a national conference on youth. We have the Estatuto da Juventude, how to say, the youth general law. We have the secretary for youth, national secretary, state secretaries. We have councils, national councils and state councils. We have not a single program that's really work for the youth. And 15% to 20% of our children or youth from 15 to 17 are out of school. They were out of school 15 years ago and still out of school today. So we have not advanced much on our youth indicators, and without that, we are not going to be able to solve poverty in the future. So our past, it's really bright. Our future is really challenging.
Thank you for the questions. I'll try to group them in order to answer them briefly. The first one, but the general idea of my answer is that when we unpack, as many of you have asked, the mechanisms through which inequality is reduced, we become very skeptical about broad statements. Let me say, for example, some words on the role of the public sector. In fact, the public sector produces both inequality reduction and inequality increasing. It depends on the policies. A very careful study made by Fernando Geiger Silveira has shown that if you look at families' budgets, the direct taxes in Brazil reduce inequality because the rich pay more than the poor. After that, a study made by Sergio Gobetti has shown that the 0.5% richest in Brazil do not pay any taxes. So if you will look at this dimension, we have different outcomes. And Silveira, in his collaborator studies, collaborators have shown that if we look at transfers, meaning Bolsa Família, BPC, pensions, and so on, again, as a whole, it produces income inequality because the public sector pension systems produces inequality. If we look at indirect taxes, it produces inequality, income inequality, because the poor pay more indirect taxes as a share of their budget than the richest. And if we look at the health and education system, it reduces inequality because the poorest have access to public sector and free services. So the operation of the public sector points toward different directions. So what we must understand is to correct those that produce inequality, or produce inequality reduction. So there is no such a thing as the public sector role. The public sector role, the public sector policies produce different outcomes, and you should grasp each of them to correct its problems. The same I can say about multidimensionality for pragmatical reasons. When we're looking at the inequality processes, inequality reduction or increasing process, we tend to look at one dimension. Let's say the white versus the non-white, women versus men, schooling years versus low skilled. But in fact, people are at the same time women, black, low skilled. And so the problem is that some people have a superposition of disadvantages. And so, but in order to pinpoint that, we should have better studies. And so nowadays, although I always say that the book I coordinated was a multi-dimensional study, indeed it was not, because we studied each dimension separately. And indeed, people is a composition of dimensions. And there are some studies on the education policy showing that if you list 10 mechanisms that can hinder people for having, for taking advantage of the opportunity in education they have, the superposition of three maybe little may eliminate the opportunity that children have had in having access to education. And so we do the best we can to understand this mechanism with the data we have, but we should go further to better understand which policies and which which strategies work better. The good news is that we are all studying that furiously in order to, and so the issue is on the agenda still. And then finally, a clarification issue. When I talked about the private sector, I have not a concept on my own. I was referring to Alesina's study, and his study was aiming at understanding under what conditions people do not support state policies and tend to favor private solutions, meaning charity or corporations. This is a broad concept. What's the problem when people favor private solutions instead of public sector ones? The problem is that when you do not support social policies as a right, in the sense that everybody is entitled to have access to, and rely upon the virtues of the providers. And so when people does not have right to, and the solutions rely upon the virtue of people, it's highly problem that where the needs are more concentrated, resources to handle them are where. When we studied that movement by Betinho and Ruth Cardoso.
Comunidade Solidária.
Yeah, we discovered that the fewer amount of initiatives was concentrated in the Northeast because there are few resources there. And the need is concentrated there. And so when you rely only upon private solution, the risk of having an unfeed between needs and resources is high. And so we cannot rely upon only this solution if we want to advance equal opportunities. That's the point. But this is a broad concept, you know. Thank you.
Let me, not much to add to what Marta and Bebe have already said, but let me refer to another report by the World Bank. At least I'm complying here with my pay. A couple of weeks ago, the World Bank released, both in Portuguese and in English, a report on youth and employment in Brazil, taking a picture of how has been the evolution and the future. And it's quite realistic in the kinds of challenges that we'll be facing with the rising share of name and the risks that are facing us. So I would recommend it as we spoke. Did you work on that, Pepe? On the, no. Second point I'd like to make is just one reference to one of the dimensions of inequality of opportunity, that gender. A colleague and I, a colleague professor of Manchester, we published a couple of papers on gender equality and economic growth in Brazil. In that area, Brazil is not among the worst performing. Of course, there's so much to do. But the fact is that the rising participation of women in the labor force was responsible for something close to 0.2% of the annual growth of GDP in the new millennium. Some of the dimensions of gender equality at least they have the legal base. The implementation is still challenging, but you have Lei Maria da Penha, for instance, which has become a template for many places of the world. Fact is that at least we don't face the kind of limitations when it comes to gender incorporation into the economy, such as in areas in the world in which women cannot still have a bank account, or just to give an idea, in Ghana, drive now they can't. They can't drive now. No. But for instance, just to give an idea of a study that I looked at it recently, the production of wheat and other agricultural products in Ghana could rise by something close to 40% if the women farmers there had access to the same sort of finance and inputs for the production. Just to give an idea. In some regards, at least in this one, of course, then we have Marielle's death. It shows how we... But the fact is that, as aptly Pepe said, there has been decrease in the inequality of opportunities. And in gender, I would say, as such a case. By the way, the multidimensional nature of poverty was partially covered in Pepe's chart showing the evolution of the Human Development Indicator, which goes beyond income. It's true, there is so much to improve in terms of access to health, in the quality of education, and so on, the conditions to leave poverty, but it's undeniable that the evolution for the better was real. Equality of opportunities and outcomes. Just remind, as we should always keep this difference in mind, because ideally we should eliminate inequality of opportunities. That's the concept of inequality that obtains the largest consensus. Even the conservatives accept that. But as Alan Kruger, former chief economist of Obama, highlighted in a series of papers, they influence each other. So the inequality of outcomes also end up affecting the inequality of opportunities. Finally, on the role of the private sector, these things are so culture embedded. That's one of the areas where culture matters. You may rely on this kind of attitude in a place like the US. It doesn't make any sense in France. And this is not good nor bad. Bebe was referring to Angus Deaton, the Nobel Prize. I had the privilege of participating in a very close discussion with him and his wife 2 months ago, in Washington, at the house of the Colombian ambassador. And they were talking to us about the opioid crisis in the US, which is something that particularly Rose, they made a study in that. And look, go to France. In France, you lose your job. You look at the unemployment insurance, and for you, that's part of your droit acquis. That's your, no, it's part of the conquest that socially you obtain a report. You feel, I'm exaggerating a bit, but you feel proud to take it. You do not hesitate. Go to the US, the same unemployment insurance for someone there in West Virginia. Socially, culturally, it's seen as a deep humiliation. Because in that country, given you were not supposed to depend on the others or depend on the state, particularly the state, to provide you the means of subsistence. So, of course, I'm not talking about the food stamps that today are taken by a substantial part of the population. I'm not talking about maybe the feeling of no hesitation by particularly the suburban blacks who feel that as part of a compensation for the past and so on. But I can tell you, sure, I had a son that lived in West Virginia. You go to West Virginia, and the guy who takes unemployment insurance, he feels ashamed of that. And that has a lot to do with the depression state associated with the stagnation and the ground ripe for the use of opioids and so on. So the point is, there is no such a thing as, a universal private solution, even if maybe it works for the Instituto Ayrton Senna, but I don't think we should, in a country like Brazil, rely so much on the fondness of private doing things. It depends even more on public policies, Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, the three of you, for this such a thrilling and interesting conversation. We will resume next Monday. On the other side of the street, there is a huge building, a great building, modern building, which is the Mindling Library, and we will meet at the auditorium there at 10 o'clock in the morning. Okay, please don't miss this information, and don't come here because there won't be nobody here on Monday.
In any case, it's just across the street.
Yeah, please. Have a nice weekend. And those that didn't sign the attendance list, please do it. Thank you.